It's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Hugh Strachan, Sir Hugh Strachan now. He is from Edinburgh. Before starting at Cambridge, he spent a little time in the Merchant Marine. Uh, and he studied at Cambridge. He was born in 1949, so he was there in the early 70s. Eventually came back to Cambridge as a tutor at Corpus Christi College. Went on from there to the University of Glasgow, where he was professor of modern history from 1992 to 2001. Then to Oxford, where he was the Chichele Professor of the History of War from 2002 to 2015, and that's where I met him. He founded or served as director of the Oxford Program on the Changing Character of War between 2004 and 2012. And he returned to Scotland to the University of St. Andrews in 2015, where he is professor of international relations. He's probably the most important historian of World War I. He did a book called The First World War, Volume 1, To Arms, another called The First World War, A New History, that accompanied a 10-part Channel 4 television series on it. But his interests extend well beyond that. He did a kind of biography of a book, Karl von Clausewitz on War. And he has also published a book on the future of war called The Direction of War. I'm only mentioning a number, 4 of his publications, because there's a whole slew of them. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to Hugh, who will be speaking to us today.
Paul, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. I should say quickly, I'm no longer a professor of international relations at St Andrews. I retired at the end of last week. So I'm adjusting to what is now full-scale retirement rather than part-time retirement. What I want to do today, and I'm not terribly sure what I can, I hope can see the map, which I'm sharing. And I will drop it when it's no longer relevant, but my grasp of technology is even worse than my grasp of my own notes. What I want to do is really set a few hairs running. I'm not going to try and give you a definitive answer as to why Germany was defeated in the First World War, lost the First World War, but I want to suggest some pointers which I think are important. And given the nature of this seminar, it seems important to begin with geopolitics and the way in which, partly the way in which it was understood before 1914, because of course it was well established by then as a way of thinking, and partly in terms of how it helps us to understand this war in retrospect as well. About 50 years ago, Paul Kennedy wrote a piece originally for the Militärgeschichtliche Mitteilungen, no longer, of course, called that, called Mahan versus Mackinder. And that became a chapter, and in a way, the pivotal chapter of a book he wrote on the rise and fall of British naval mastery. And I think I've spoken about this to the Mackinder Forum before. But it's worth, I think, just going through the outline of Paul's debate, because I want to take issue with it. And I think it gets in the way in some respects when we try to understand what's going on in this war. Because what Paul did in that article and then in the book was to say, Mackinder in his 1904 lecture at the Royal Geographical Society got it right. That is to say, Eurasia was becoming a united continental landmass, that the railway would enable the major continental powers, and particularly Russia in the long term, given its position in Eurasia, to dominate the Eurasian landmass, and sea power would therefore be under threat. And that sea empires were in a way the things of the past. There may have been great sea empires before Britain's, Venice, in the Netherlands, Portuguese, Spain, and so on, but they would not be able to hack it in the future. And that provided the conditions for which he looked at British sea power in the First World War, because it enabled Paul to conclude that really the blockade had had very limited effect. Secondly, that this was a war won predominantly on land, and that Germany, I suppose you might add, by way of gloss, being above all a land power, if Germany was the center of the Central Powers, as the pivot of that alliance, then Germany had to be defeated in the main theatre, in the main war. Surprisingly, it was an argument that resonated with the works of people like John Terraine, with whom I suspect Paul didn't really have much in common, but John Terraine's argument that Britain, had to put its main effort into the main theatre of the war, which was the Western Front, had to create a mass army to do that, had to introduce conscription to do that, and therefore to conform, if you like, to the pattern of major continental powers like Germany and France, and for that matter, Russia. Now, what I want to say is, first of all, let's just take that railway argument for a moment, and that's why I've got the map up at the moment. And the map, which I hope you can all see, is from a 1910 atlas, and it shows the railway network of Europe as it stood then, and effectively, therefore, as it stood in 1914. And the simple point I want to make about it is, I think, visually pretty evident, which is that the network is much denser in Northern and Western Europe than it is anywhere else. I think at the time it was reckoned that Belgium had the most comprehensive railway network of Europe. Of course, it was a small country and therefore it had less distance to cover. But the corollary of that argument is look at Russia. And the Russian network has still a long way to go. Russia's building railways at a great pace, and is well aware of their importance in terms which the Mackinder argument would support. But if you look at it in relation to its capacity to move supplies, troops, to focus that, and above all, to project power beyond its own frontiers, remembering, of course, that the Russian railway gauge is different from that of Central and Western Europe, a problem you still can, as I've had to do today, confront when you have to change trains to go into Ukraine, because you're on a narrow gauge railway. Then that in itself it means that in 1914, that latent power of, if you like, the Eurasian continental landmass still has a long way to go. Now, that clearly does not mean that the railway network, which you can see in Germany and in Belgium in particular, is not much more developed than that. And clearly Austria-Hungary is not far behind in terms of its railway density. So this is not to say that railways aren't enormously important in the First World War. They certainly are, and I'll come back to them at the end in terms of my summarizing my argument about why Germany does lose this war. They are enormously important, but the network is not yet at the scale that Mackinder had foretold, if you like, if you take the Royal Geographical Society lecture of 1904 as a sort of state of play as it was then. And having gone back to that article, let me make a further point, which is, it seems to me that if you read what Mackinder is doing, and if you think the context within which he is doing it, then his concern goes beyond simply saying that Russia and the Eurasian landmass will become more powerful in relation to maritime empires as a result of the development of the railway. The point at the heart of what he is saying is, what is Britain going to do about this? Because clearly this will be a direct threat to Britain and to Britain's capacity to use its maritime power effectively. So it's a challenge, not a statement of an inevitable situation. Britain has to respond to this. And it's important, I think, to remember that Mackinder himself is heavily involved. He's involved with the liberal imperialists. He's close to people like Sir Edward Grey, who will become Foreign Secretary the next year. He is he writes about democracy and the sea. He writes about Britain and the sea, and he realizes that if Britain is to sustain both its current position and its empire, then maritime power is going to be central to this. So I think we need that context in recognizing what he's trying to do. What he is therefore not in a way doing is saying no to Mahan, which is the implication of this adversarial relationship that Paul Kennedy set up in the argument. But actually, what's Mahanianism, if to put it in those terms, going to do about this problem? And a big part of what I want to say this morning or this afternoon or this evening or whatever time frame you are on is that sea power is central to how we understand the defeat of Germany. And this is not a Mahan versus Mackinder argument or a sea power versus land power argument. It's an argument that actually in a major European war, which in due course becomes a major world war, then none of these things can be exclusive of the other. The answer here is not to create a false opposite, but to think about a synthesis and to think about how these things interact rather than pursue an argument which essentially reduces things to problems which are not how they are presented at the time. Geopolitics as a word had obviously arrived in the English language as a result of Mackinder's work. I've never been known, and probably somebody on this call will know far better than I, how far he was influenced by Friedrich Ratzel, who the true founder in many ways of geopolitics, who had died the very same year in which Mackinder gave his lecture in 1904. Ratzel had recognized, looking at the map, that Germany faced a problem, that Germany had this problem of being contained by neighboring countries, that Germany's response to this in some respects would have to be to use the sea in order to expand. And of course, Weltpolitik and the Bülow government's embrace of Weltpolitik reflected that idea that Germany, if it were to expand, would need to look beyond the European continent. But also, of course, he recognized that railways could be a path to invasion and a route for Germany as a land power to invade its immediate neighbors. I don't see, and again, I'd be interested to know what others think about this, that any of these names, Ratzel, Mackinder, or geopolitics, really figure significantly in government debates during the First World War. Mackinder is obviously still alive and has the capacity to be active and is actually given a job at the very end of the war in what is now, or was then too, southern Ukraine, which he didn't do very well, it has to be said, but it was a difficult situation. So he's not, and he is close to the Liberal government that survives until the Asquith forms a coalition in 1915. But the way in which people are looking at the map is actually much more to be understood, I think, through the vocabulary of 19th century strategic thought rather than geopolitical thought. Because what this looks like to the military mind of those trained at staff colleges, and above all trained in what we might see as a Jominian tradition, is a war being fought on exterior lines as opposed to interior lines, or a war fought between exterior lines and interior lines. And let me just explain a bit about what I mean. And perhaps the first thing to say here is that in the world of 1914 professional military education, Jomini may not be read directly much anymore, but he still is in many respects the founding figure. And it's still an important figure in Russia, where he ended up at the latter stages of his life. But he is a man who believes that you can understand strategy from a map. and used maps very extensively. His Traité de Grande Opération Militaire had an atlas volume that went with it, totally different, if you like, from Clausewitz's approach to, a similar set of contemporary problems, an attempt to find solutions to strategic problems. And at the core of his thinking about Napoleonic warfare is that at the operational level, not at what I'm talking about now, which is more a strategic level, but at the operational level, the core question was: are you going to operate on the battlefield on interior lines or exterior lines? In other words, are you going to envelop an enemy, surround an enemy, or are you going to divide an enemy and place yourself between components? And he had and those influenced by him had argued that essentially Napoleon had two forms of fighting. One was to pin an enemy from the front and then to envelop, the sort of thing which we imagine the German plans of 1914 were designed to do. And the other to place the main body of the army between separate components of the enemy army and defeat one and then the other. And so exterior lines are, if you like, what are a caricature, and I use the word caricature advisedly, what our caricature of the German war plan looks like. In other words, German army is going to sweep through the Low Countries, come down onto Paris, go west of Paris rather than east of Paris, and will roll up the French army against the Swiss border or against the German border. And a totally improbable undertaking in terms of its achievement. But that is an idea of operating on exterior lines. What the British General Staff during the course of the First World War, and here I in particular have William Robertson, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff between late 1915 and early 1918, what he writes when he looks at the situation as it has developed by 1915-16 is that here within Europe, you have an alliance that is on interior lines fighting an alliance which is on exterior lines. Perhaps I need a map with different colors just to make this point. But if you look at the map that is in front of you, Germany has as its immediate neighbor, of course, to the southwest, Austria-Hungary, in whose name nominally it is fighting, at least in terms of how the war is caused. And at the end of 1914, at the end of October 1914, it has added the Ottoman Empire to its alliance, which actually means that problem of encirclement with which so many Germans had been concerned before 1914, and which did seem to concern Bethmann Hollweg, the German Chancellor, when he tried to rupture the entente that faced the Triple Alliance before the outbreak of the war, that problem of encirclement in some ways was resolved because the alliance with the Ottoman Empire gave Germany and Austria-Hungary a route to the southeast and out of Europe. But crucially, that route was one which became cemented by the outcome of the Gallipoli campaign. In September 1915, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers, exposing Serbia to invasion from the east. And the result was that Austria-Hungary, which had struggled to deal with Serbia in the early stages of the war, has now overrun, with German help, with considerable German help, has overrun Serbia. And the direct route that runs from Berlin through to Istanbul, to Constantinople, is now entirely in the hands of the Central Powers. And indeed, if you want to understand the defeat at Gallipoli, I think you have to begin there, that from the autumn of 1915, heavy artillery and other artillery too can be got by rail and of course along the Danube to the Ottoman Empire, and that in itself creates a panic in the minds of the British and French commanders at Gallipoli. So here is an alliance running, if you like, from the Baltic coast to the Black Sea, which is contiguous, which has common borders. And that means that as far as a German-led alliance is concerned, that it can switch troops from front to front with a degree of flexibility that means it can firefight its way through this war. And that's essentially what it does until the winter of 1917-18. So you get in the winter of 1914-15 the decision taken by Falkenhayn that actually let's concentrate on Russia. Let's see what we can do there. And with any luck, we'll get Russia to agree a separate peace. And that will give us a one-front problem because Falkenhayn does see Britain as Germany's central concern. And the important thing, therefore, is to be able to concentrate on defeating Britain on the Western Front within the context of its alliance with France. But you do that by getting Russia out of the equation first. I think Falkenhayn himself would have preferred to do that simply by negotiation, but the pressure, of course, from Hindenburg and Ludendorff is it should be done through defeating Russia. Crucially, of course, the effort to do that is unsuccessful. But what you then get is Falkenhayn switching the effort to the West for 1916. And of course, what in 1917, his successors, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, Hindenburg being the chief of the General Staff, were able to do is concentrate in October 1917 on the Italian front, giving support to Austria-Hungary there and overrunning Italy. So in other words, this railway network is working quite efficiently in enabling Germany to hold the ring and indeed to expand the ring. I mean, what it does essentially by the summer of 1918, by that time, of course, Russia is out of the war, but what it has done is expanded largely during the course of 1915 itself across Russian Poland, well into Russia itself, is taken control of much of the Balkans through Serbia and Bulgaria. Greece, of course, was mentioned, and one of the important points, which I'll come to when I'm just going to say a few words about seapower in a moment, is that Italy and Greece, both under pressure, of course, to join the Triple Alliance, the Central Powers, are also much more exposed to the influence of sea power because of their projection into the Mediterranean. So geopolitically, both countries are caught, if you like, in a bind. And actually, there is no real choice economically as to which way they will have to go ultimately. Although in the case of Greece, there's much more direct pressure. In fact, pressure which clearly breaches everything that the Entente said it's been standing for in terms of the defense of Belgium to get Greece into the war on their side in 1917. But as far as Italy is concerned, it's a much more free decision taken by Italy. So here you have a bloc surrounded by an alliance running from Britain through France to Italy after its entry in May 1915, with Greece quite sensibly staying neutral still in 1915, and then through to the Black Sea, only of course they can't get through to the Black Sea, to Russia. These countries are only physically contiguous at one point, which is on the Franco-Italian border. Otherwise, all communication between them is being done by sea. And they are operating, in Willie Robertson's mind, and indeed in Falkenhayn's mind as he thinks about these problems, on exterior lines. They are able to, and those exterior lines are not those of an operational land battle as they were in Napoleonic terms. These exterior lines are the lines created by maritime navigation. And that in itself means that sea control, the control of the seas around the European continent, both to the west and to the south, becomes central to how the Entente powers are going to fight this war, will fight this war. That seems to be the essential framing in geographical terms for how this war is going to be conducted. There is a further point, which, no, I won't come to it now. I was going to talk more about rails, but I'll come back to that. I think that's jumping the gun. The point here, I think, about exterior lines for the Entente is that what that enables the Entente to do is to maintain trade with the rest of the world, to sustain its balance of payments as best it can. It enables it to control the immediate coast around Europe, and especially that matters in relation to the North Sea, which is, if you like, a dead zone between Britain and Germany. Germany, by contrast, can control the Baltic, and it can control, in conjunction, of course, with its allies, Italy and France, it can control much of the Mediterranean. And that, in turn, means it can put troops where it wants to put them. This doesn't actually mean amphibious operations after Gallipoli. It's striking how, this is, I think, one of the problems with, mentioned Mahan, those who talk about Corbett in relation to British thinking in the First World War. He is indeed an enormously influential and important thinker, but there are two ways in which what he wrote in 1911 and some principles of maritime strategy don't apply. One is that this is not a limited war for Britain. He had argued on the basis of the 18th century precedents that Britain could take a limited role in the war because it was not of the continent of Europe, and it could essentially subsidize allies, keep them in the fight, which it certainly does do in the First World War, that it could do that, and fight limited amphibious operations at remote points of enemy territory. And Gallipoli is really the nearest it gets to trying to do Corbett, and having failed, doesn't do it anymore. Corbett, of course, recognized the setback that constituted for his own thinking, but I don't think he ever really thought through the implications. The implications of this, that Britain actually is fighting a war so great and so demanding that it's not a question of relying simply on its given dominance at sea, but that it will have to create a large land army as well. It will have to make sure that France and Russia stay in this fight, because what sea power can do and what operating on exterior lines can do is ultimately enable Britain to win a long war. The danger is that Britain will lose the war in the short term. If France had been overrun, for example, in 1914, then Britain would not have had a foothold on the continent. It would have to do what it did in the Second World War, which was think about how you launch a major amphibious operation. And the chances of pulling that off in the circumstances of 1914-18 seem to me pretty remote. So what is going on here is about the exercise of other forms of maritime power. Has much less to do, for example, with warship numbers, although both navies, both British and German navies, are preoccupied with warship numbers, and much more to do with shipping capacity and the security of the sea lanes and the security of maritime transport. Because linked to that is, above all, the relationship with the United States. What Britain is doing, and this is, if you like, Corbettian in terms of how it's thinking about its strategy, is that it's using its ability to trade globally, to maintain its balance of power, its balance of trade, and as best it can, to peg the pound sterling to the dollar exchange rate in order to keep the cost of US goods down. And it's doing that not primarily on its own behalf, but on behalf of Russia from the end of 1914, on behalf of Italy from the moment it enters the war in 1915, and on behalf of France in 1916. Famously, in November 1916, Woodrow Wilson, as the American president, issued a warning to the Federal Reserve Board about its degree of dependence and the degree of dependence on Wall Street on an Allied victory, an Entente victory in this war. American shareholders essentially invested in stock which would only pay back if the Allies had won the war. And at that moment, of course, Britain is borrowing enormous amounts on Wall Street in order to be able to fund the war effort, not primarily of itself, but of the alliance as a whole. It's borrowing for everybody because it has the capacity to do that. It's foreign debt. It worries a great deal about managing this foreign debt, but it is seapower that underpins its capacity to do that. Germany, by the same token, and this is an important point in Germany's defeat, is cut out from that. It's cut out both physically and financially. Physically, because of course, after the end of 1914, its navy cannot get out of the North Sea, at least in regards to surface ships. It struggles to trade with the United States. Not the United States would not have traded with Germany. It certainly would have done, but it is not going to be able to do so successfully just because it can't get merchant ships. It operates through neutral traders, but Britain is tightening the blockade. The blockade is not a perfect thing. The only answer, therefore, for Germany after 1915 is the submarine and the development of the submarine. And I think probably one of the causes of the German defeat, this is a hypothetical, I haven't really thought it through because I'm going to make a rather grand statement, is if Germany had actually planned to fight a submarine campaign much earlier in the war, had it therefore developed a sufficient number of submarines to be able to sustain it, and had thought through just how they might conduct it in ways which married with what it was doing on land, so that you had joint effects, then it might have delivered more. As it is, of course, in 1917, the German submarine campaign creates panic in Britain, deep concern in Britain, and calls into question its ability to sustain itself at war. So that seems to be the importance of the map. These are the conditions that shape what is going on here. Now, let's just think for a moment, going back when I've still got the map up, to what has happened to Germany as a result of its successes in 1914, 1915, and 1916. In 1914, it overruns northeastern France. And that in itself gives it control of an extension of what we might see as the Ruhr coalfield and the iron ore and so on, which is in northeastern France, as well, of course, as the resources of Belgium. In 1915, it extends itself into Russia, reaches well into Russia, and at the end of the year, it extends that reach even further by the overrunning of Bulgaria, by Bulgaria joining the alliance, and by the overrunning of Serbia. It's also, of course, trying to sustain the Ottoman Empire in this war. And the value of the Ottoman Empire in this war, as far as Germany is concerned, is this enables Germany to threaten the British, French, and Russian empires with the possibility of insurgency in those empires, which ties down at least some troops, not that many in practice, and not many that could actually be deployed into Europe, but ties down a number of troops out of the main theatres of the war. I suppose the army on which this has the biggest effect is actually the Russian army, although it's the least discussed, as there is revolution within Central Asia in 1916. But Germany is actually probably unable fully to exploit that in terms of gun running and enabling the cry of jihad and so on to have the sorts of effects that people like John Buchan had imagined when he was writing Green Mantle in 1915-16. So there is here an enormous extension of what Germany is trying to do with its railway network. And this matters enormously in 1918 because actually the railway network is now collapsing. It's not the rolling stock's not being replaced. The network itself hasn't had further investment. The quality of the coal that Germany can use to power its locomotives worsens the strain on the engines and also doesn't deliver sufficient power. So the whole capacity to operate on interior lines is beginning to seize up. And not only that, its capacity to supply formations which are at a distance from Berlin is also seizing up. The classic illustration of this point would be what happens in Russia, because the anticipation with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918 is that will give Germany and Austria-Hungary access to the Ukrainian breadbasket. And recent experience, of course, highlights for us just how important that is in wider terms beyond Ukraine. Remember that Germany, before the war, imports most of its grain from Russia anyway. So the desire to have that is important. But what actually happens in 1918 is that there is very little benefit to either Germany or Austria-Hungary domestically from its control of the food supplies of what is then, if you like, Western Russia, because the troops that they have deployed in the East are eating it up themselves. Those troops militarily aren't achieving a great deal, but they're still hungry and they still have mouths that need feeding. And that, I think, illustrates exactly the challenge which, if you like, the overstretch of Germany has created logistically and also, of course, domestically, because you have a system of distribution which is entirely landlocked and depends, therefore, on those internal communications to get goods from the countryside to the town, and implies that this can be made to operate effectively. I don't want to over-exaggerate, because, of course, you have communications by waterway, by canal, and so on within Europe, which can act as some substitute for the railways and do act as substitute for the railways. So the Rhine and the Danube and so on continue to be enormously important. But by 1918, the railway has, in some respects, ceased to be an asset and become a liability. By contrast, what has happened for those operating on maritime communications is that you're now thinking about how you can make this work much more effectively for the Entente. And I think it's important to remember, particularly because some maritime and naval historians have said Britain should never have engaged in continentalism. It should always stuck to a maritime strategy in the First World War. This was a disaster, both in terms of loss of life, but and also in terms of how its strategy could have been effective. I think what that fails to recognize is that the principal decisions about British strategy being made by British cabinet ministers between 1914 and 1916 are being made predominantly by the group that we described as liberal imperialists, who are through and through maritime thinkers, who see Britain's power as vested in the Navy, its capacity to trade, and its ability to sustain the sea lines of communication. That goes for Grey, the Foreign Secretary. He makes that point in his speech that takes Britain into the war on the 3rd of August 1914 in the Commons. It goes for Lloyd George, but certainly, who of course becomes the Prime Minister in December 1916. It goes from McKenna, who is the Chancellor of the Exchequer until December 1916 and had been First Lord of the Admiralty before. They would all rather have seen a maritime strategy and not the creation of a continental army. But the situation that Britain finds itself in is it has to have a continental army and maintain a maritime strategy. The point here is that it couldn't put a continental army on the continent if it didn't have control of the sea. And it certainly couldn't have put forces into other theatres of the war as it does, whether that is into to Gallipoli or more immediately after that into Macedonia, into Thessaloniki, and indeed in 1917 into Italy and the Italian front, let alone the theatres outside Europe, and especially, of course, in relation to the end of the war, the Ottoman fronts, the ongoing Ottoman fronts, that is to say, those in Mesopotamia and Palestine. So that capacity to maintain the maritime capability that it has is crucial simply in terms of using land power. There is no alternative here to that. And that means that you need equipment from overseas, you need to be able to continue trading overseas in order to deliver the equipment that is required, and also, as I've said already, to maintain the balance of power. Now, if you think of how Britain's maritime communications are constructed in 1914, the emphasis among many is to think of the empire, if you like, as a closed economic unit. Britain is still wedded, it has a liberal government, to the principles of free trade, but with the decline of relative economic independence, no longer the first, it was the first industrialized country in the world, but the point is it has serious competition and has been overtaken by the United States and by Germany in terms of industrial production. What it has to do is to think how it rationalizes those relationships. And what it does do is effectively abandon the empire, except for Canada, in order to concentrate on one route in particular, which is the transatlantic route. So Australia, New Zealand, even India, and certainly anywhere on the further side of Africa, are going to take second ranking in order to maintain and concentrate the shipping that is being used on the much shorter Atlantic route. This is why the 1917 submarine campaign is so important, the Battle of the Atlantic of the First World War. It is because that is the waterway through which this whole effort is being sustained. And the US, of course, is, and Wilson was right, therefore, in November 1917, is being sucked, November 1916, is being sucked into this by the reliance of the Entente collectively on what the US is producing and the profits that that is making for the United States. So if you like, to try and bring all this to a denouement, which is actually the defeat rather than set the conditions for it, that what matters about the US entry is, first of all, that it deals with the problem of the debt that is being mounted up by the alliance. It gets Britain off that hook because although the US will demand the repayment of the debt, the fact that the US is now a belligerent does, of course, mean that there will be sufficient credit to see the war through. Secondly, the US Navy can become an immediate participant in the war. It's extraordinary in all the attention to the creation of the American Expeditionary Force and its dispatch to Europe, to which I'll come to in a minute, that people forget about the US Navy's entry. Sims immediately arrives in London, and the US, the question of command is not debated as it is in the land war. The US Navy in the North Sea subordinates itself to British command and is almost immediately effective. And above all, given the importance of that submarine battle in the Atlantic, the U-boat campaign, the US Navy provides destroyers as escorts for convoys. The one thing that the Navy has been extraordinarily short of, because roughly 100 destroyers are needed to escort the Grand Fleet if it puts to sea. There's a perennial shortage of destroyers for the protection of merchant vessels. Convoy helps that because you're concentrating ships together, and you can therefore use destroyers more rationally, but it doesn't solve it. And the final point is that with the US entry to the war, the blockade becomes effective as it has never done before. Britain always, up till April 1917, although it sees the economic war and the blockade of Germany as a central instrument in what it is doing, is conditioned by not offending the United States as it does so. As Grey himself, the Foreign Secretary, put it, we want the maximum of blockade with the minimum of offense to the United States. Once the United States is in, then you don't have to worry about that, because the United States actually becomes even more radical in implementation of the blockade than Britain had wanted to be. The United States, having been the principal neutral, is no longer the protector of the neutrals. So those border neutrals through which Germany is trying to import, the Low Countries, Sweden, Switzerland, are now subject to a very tight blockade themselves, implemented on essentially United States instructions. Britain never had the courage to do that in those terms. And we forget now, but nature helps, because the 1916 and 1917 were both very bad harvests. It was across Europe, whether you were a belligerent or not a belligerent, the harvests were bad. And the result was that the neutrals had very little food to be able to pass into Germany, however high the prices were in Germany that they might have got for that food. They had to feed their own populations first. So the blockade really takes an effect after the US entry in a way that it had never done before. So the last thing that has an impact is the arrival of the American Expeditionary Force. I realize I'm testing your patience in terms of time. So, Paul, you better give me a wave at me if you tell me what to shut up. Will you give me another 5 to 10 minutes? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm taking that as a yes. So the AEF, of course, also needs to use the sea to get to Europe. It has to have a safe sea route. The Battle of the Atlantic matters to the United States as much as it matters to the United Kingdom. But crucially, unlike 1944 or after 1941, it has somewhere in France to go, because France is still in the fight. So it bypasses Britain. The AEF can go straight to France. And now the railway construction, I'm often reminded of this. If anyone travels south of Paris and you go through all those marshalling yards towards Loire and the double and treble and quadruple railway lines as you go south of Paris, this is all infrastructure put in place very often with American money to enable the AEF to deploy into eastern France. So landing in Le Havre, Boulogne, and Le Havre and Brest and so on, and then moving directly across central France, ultimately, of course, to the Meuse-Argonne. And and what you're getting in that case is new railway construction integrated with ports, delivering troops to theatre. What that also means is that those old debates, which actually are much more important for Germany than they are for the Entente powers, about whether the Eastern Front or the Western Front matters more, become totally redundant. Because in 1918, Russia is out of the war, so to that extent, the Western Front has to be a priority. But much more importantly, the American Expeditionary Force is only ever going to fight in France. It's never going to fight anywhere else. America never declares war against the Ottoman Empire, and it only declares war against Austria-Hungary very belatedly at the end of 1917. And you couldn't have got the American Expeditionary Force at the size at which it will aspires to be, which of course is the largest army on the Western Front by November 1918. You couldn't have got it anywhere except France. It's the only place it could fight. So the Western Front has now become, in inverted commas, decisive in a way that it never had been before. And that element of decisiveness is enhanced by the German offensives of the first half of 1918, because they themselves consume about 1 million men, and the best 1 million men in most cases, because of the use of stormtroopers, elite forces, in the first half of the year. And at the same time, extend Germany's front yet further, giving the German army in the West a much bigger task defensively when it has to hold that ground. Now, to wrap up, let me just say what actually happens at the very end. Because through most of 1918, the question still is, can the Entente powers hold out before the American Expeditionary Force and the United States arrive en masse? Everybody can see the possibility of victory in 1919 or 1920 at the latest. The worry is that they're going to lose the war before the American Expeditionary Force can become effective. The French army has peaked in strength in 1917. The British army has effectively peaked in strength by the end of 1917. And the arrival of the Americans in force is the only thing that's going to bail them out in that context. On the 18th of July, 1918, on the Western Front, Foch launches the first of his counteroffensives. And of course, American troops play a crucial role in that battle, in that counteroffensive. And on the 8th of August, there's an Anglo-French offensive launched at Amiens to clear the railway station or the railway lines of communication. And Foch's design, and the point here for the Western Front, just to make a quick point about how this war is fought, is that Foch's design is to focus on clearing railway lines, securing communications, so that logistically the base for the combined forces of the Entente or combined forces of the Allies can be supplied into the fighting, which he's still anticipating will go on till 1919. And that the superiority industrially and economically, which the Entente now enjoys, the Allies now enjoy, which is coming together principally because of the US entry to the war, that can be fully maximized. And he can do that in a way which means, for example, that he can launch offensives sequentially and even simultaneously on the Western Front, because there is now so much artillery available to him, for example, that he doesn't have to move it every time an offensive is launched on a different sector. So the German army is being put under concentrated attack. Now, most British historians will say, and would probably stop the story here, because they would say the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August 1918 is described in Ludendorff's memoirs as the Black Day of the German army. The German army seemed to crumble on that day, and Ludendorff concluded that it was a day from which the German army never recovered. Well, the answer is it did recover, and it continued to fight, of course, until November 1918. It had largely recovered by the 14th of August 1918, which was a day on which the German General Staff, which nominally did hold a sort of supreme command, had all its allies in for a conference to think about the way forward. What nobody pays any attention to is the second part of that paragraph in Ludendorff's memoirs, where he says it was essentially the worst thing that happened in the defeat of Germany, except for the collapse of what he calls the Quadruple Alliance. And this is where the map comes back into play, because what Germany can no longer do is shuttle troops from one front to the other. It is now too stretched on the Western Front to be able to bail out Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. And each of those is now fighting a war which is not its war. None of them have any desire or any need to fight the United States. Indeed, most of them can't see any point in fighting Britain or France. The defeat of Russia and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and then the defeat of Romania, have resolved the problems of the East for Austria-Hungary and for Bulgaria and for the Ottoman Empire. So why not, at this point, simply settle, which is exactly what they want to do. It is Germany that is forcing them to stay in the fight. When, on the 15th September 1918, Franchet d'Esprit launches the Allied offensive in Macedonia and breaks through, Bulgaria collapses within 2 weeks. Bulgaria asks Germany for 7 divisions to reinforce it on the Macedonian front. And Ludendorff says, I can't do it. I haven't got the 7 divisions and I can't move them because the railways won't do it. And I have to concentrate on shoring up the Western Front. So Bulgaria seeks an armistice. Even then, of course, Germany continues fighting. And indeed, there are reports, Ludendorff does seek an armistice from that point, but there are those in OHL and the German Supreme Command who say, actually, we're holding fine in the West, we can continue fighting. But it is the beginning of the process which leads Germany to seek an armistice, which then, of course, also triggers responses from Austria-Hungary and from the Ottoman Empire. I think what's important to recognize, too, is that although there are those who say we actually should have rejected, on the Western side, on the Allied side, and particularly on the American side of Pershing, would like to, we should have carried on the war into 1919 in order to inflict a major defeat on the German army in the West. There are those who also are saying, actually, we need to seize the moment to negotiate, because if we can strip away the Allies from Germany, if we can strip away Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and ultimately Austria-Hungary, as indeed they are able to do, then we will be able more effectively to prosecute the war against Germany if Germany continues to fight into 1919. So the other fronts remain important. And if you look at the terms of each of the armistices negotiated before that with Germany on the 11th of November, what the Allies are doing is ensuring they have full control of the sea routes in the case of the Ottoman Empire. They want access to the Black Sea, and of the land routes in relation to Bulgaria and Austria-Hungary, so that they can pile troops into Germany from the south and ultimately possibly even from the east, if they can get Russia back in the war as a result of controlling the Black Sea. So there is here, even with the armistices, a plan for a long war which will ensure Germany's defeat. In reality, of course, the armistice is set in train a process, which means that some of the effects economically which Germany has been suffering during the course of the war, both, as Paul Kennedy will put it, from the sustained effort of fighting, and as the maritime strategists would put it, from the effects of the blockade, have begun to take effect. And at that point, the situation is effectively irrecoverable. And the final armistice, that of the 11th of November, does actually inflict on Germany the military defeat that it has not suffered in the West fully, because it demands the surrender of the equipment and, of course, navally of the ships, which would enable it to renew the fight if it had decided ultimately to reject the peace treaty of 1919. Remember, an armistice, a point, of course, that is true of ceasefires today as we think about Iran, that an armistice is a temporary deal which has to be regularly renewed. So right from November 1918 until June, July 1919, there is a possibility that war could return. That possibility is dented by the very terms of the armistices which the Allies have negotiated. I'm sorry, I've talked for longer than I ever intended to, but once I'm on a roll, I find it hard to stop. And Paul, you'd be very tolerant and not tell me to shut up.